On my wedding day, while expecting eternal happiness, I was slapped in front of everyone, and at that moment, I made a decision. They wanted to silence me, but I rewrote my own life. You'll understand why when you watch until the end. It was a radiant morning in San Miguel de Allende, and Grace felt like she was living a dream. Her reflection in the mirror smiled back at her nervously but happily as her stylist carefully adjusted the veil over her braided hair. The ceremony was hours away, and every detail, from the hand-embroidered lace dress to the fresh flowers decorating the room, seemed designed for a fairy tale. Today will be perfect, she thought, as her best friend Camila entered with a glass of champagne in her hand. Today is your day. Don't let anything or anyone ruin it, Camila said, trying to calm Grace's trembling hands. However, the peace of that moment crumbled when Diego's mother, Rose, entered unannounced, dressed in an outfit that seemed more appropriate for a mother of the bride than a mother-in-law. Rose did not hide her disapproval as she examined Grace from head to toe. "Is that the dress you chose? I thought it would be something more appropriate for the occasion," she said with a fake smile full of venom. Grace felt the blow like an invisible slap, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had dealt with Rose's microaggressions since the beginning of her relationship with Diego, but she never imagined she would have to endure them on such a special day. Camila, always quick to defend her friend, stepped forward. "You look spectacular, right? It's an exclusive design, not like those generic boutique dresses," Camila replied, smiling defiantly. Rose frowned, but did not reply. She simply turned on her heels and left the room, leaving behind an air of unbearable tension. Hours later, the ceremony began, and she looked stunning as she walked down the aisle, but something about Diego seemed distracted. During the vows, he avoided eye contact and constantly checked his cell phone. Every notification that vibrated in his pocket seemed more important than the woman standing in front of him, promising to love him in sickness and in health. When the reception began, the situation only got worse. Rose didn't miss an opportunity to make hurtful comments about Grace's guests, referring to them as noisy or out of place. Instead of defending his wife, Diego chose to remain silent, or even worse, laugh nervously to ease the tension. The breaking point came when Rose, with a glass of wine in her hand, approached the microphone to propose a toast. What began as seemingly kind words soon turned into public humiliation. "Diego, dear, you have always had a noble heart. I hope this marriage is everything you dream of, although some dreams don't always end as we hope," she said, looking directly at Grace. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt the weight of everyone's gaze in the room, and before she could process what was happening, she heard a murmur behind her. Turning around, she saw Diego raising his voice in an argument with Camila, who was trying to confront him about his indifference. "Diego, for God's sake, defend her!" Camila shouted, losing her patience. The room was in shock when Diego, in a fit of rage, slapped Grace in front of everyone. The physical impact was minor, but the emotional pain was devastating. Grace staggered, but remained steadfast as the murmurs turned into cries of outrage. "This is over," she said in a voice that echoed throughout the room. Without waiting for a response, she ripped the ring off her finger and threw it on the main table. The entire room watched as she walked toward the exit with dignity and determination, leaving behind a sea of whispers and stunned faces. Camila caught up with her outside and hugged her as tears finally flowed. That night, Grace made the decision not to let anyone else humiliate her or make her feel less than she was worth. "This isn't the end," Camila said, holding her tightly. "It's just the beginning of something much better." Grace nodded, wiping away her tears. Although broken, something inside her was beginning to burn, the spark of a woman determined to rebuild herself. The spark of a woman determined to rebuild herself. That night, Grace took refuge in Camila's small apartment, a modest but warm place decorated with photographs of trips and shared memories. Sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea she barely touched, Grace mentally reviewed the events of the last few hours. Every insult, every look of contempt, and above all, Diego's public slap repeated themselves in her mind, like a movie she couldn't stop. Do you want to talk about it? Camila asked as she offered her a blanket. Grace shook her head, but her eyes betrayed the sea of emotions she was trying to contain. After a few minutes of silence, she finally spoke. How did I get to this point, Cammy? I thought he was different, that he really loved me, but he allowed his mother to insult me. And worst of all, what he did in front of everyone. Her voice broke. He's a coward, Fer, but you know you're not. Look, this is the worst night of your life, but it can also be the beginning of something better. Tomorrow we'll go to your house together and pick up all your things. You don't have to face this alone. Grace nodded, grateful for her friend's strength. However, fear and uncertainty gnawed at her. How would she face Diego and Rose the next day? How could she start from scratch after so much time invested in that relationship? The next morning, after a sleepless night, Grace and Camila headed to the apartment she shared with Diego. With the help of Gabriel, Grace's older brother, they planned to get in and out quickly before Diego could return from work. Are you sure you want to do it now? We could wait a little longer, Gabriel asked as he parked his truck in front of the building. No, Gabby, I need to close this chapter today, Grace replied, trying to sound confident. Although her hands trembled as she entered, the familiarity of the place hit Grace like a bucket of cold water. The photographs of their trips together still hung on the walls. The scent of his cologne still permeated the air, and the echo of the arguments of the last few months seemed to resonate in every corner. Camila wasted no time. She took boxes from Gabriel's car and began packing Grace's clothes and belongings, while Grace remained motionless in the center of the room. Fair, don't look back. Just pack what you need. This place doesn't deserve your tears, Camila said firmly. Suddenly, the door burst open. Diego had arrived earlier than expected. His face was marked by a hangover, and his dark gaze exuded rage when he saw Grace with her friends. What the hell is going on here? He shouted, slamming the door shut. Gabriel, with his imposing stature, stood between Diego and Grace. She came to pick up her things. Don't make this any harder than it already is, Gabriel said calmly, but with a clear threat in his tone. Diego ignored Gabriel and went straight to Grace. So this is what you do. Run away like a coward after everything I did for you, he said with venom in every word. Grace looked him straight in the eye, feeling anger replace fear. What you did was allow your mother to humiliate me and hit me in front of everyone. No, Diego, you destroyed this, and I'm not going to stay here so you can continue trampling on me. Diego moved toward her, but Gabriel stopped him with a firm hand on his chest. Don't take another step, Diego. I'm not going to warn you again. For a moment, it seemed that Diego was going to respond with violence, but Gabriel's presence made him back down. Breathing heavily, he slumped down on the sofa while Grace and Camila continued packing. You know what, Grace? No one else will love you the way I did. You're too complicated. His voice was a whisper laden with cruelty. Diego's words pierced like knives. But this time, Grace didn't let them destroy her. Closing the last box, she turned to him and said, I'd rather be alone than with someone who doesn't know the meaning of respect. With Gabriel and Camila's help, they loaded the boxes into the truck and left the apartment. As they drove away, Grace took one last look at the building, where she had once imagined a happy future. Now it was only a symbol of what she was leaving behind. At Gabriel's house, Grace began to unpack. Each object she put in its place was a small step toward her new life. Camila, as always, was by her side. Fer, I have an idea. Remember that fashion design project you always dreamed of? Now is the perfect time to start it. You have talent, you have creativity, and now you have freedom. Grace smiled for the first time in what seemed like days. Although she still felt the weight of the past, a small spark of hope began to burn inside her. Maybe you're right, Cammy. Maybe this is the beginning of something much better. In the days that followed, Grace began to adapt to her new reality. Although the shadow of the past still haunted her, her determination to rebuild her life grew with each small step. Gabriel, always protective, offered to let her stay at his house for as long as she needed, but Grace knew she didn't want to depend on anyone for too long. One morning, while they were having breakfast together, Gabriel broke the silence. Fair, don't get mad, but have you thought about what you're going to do with your career? Or where you're going to live? He asked while checking his cell phone. Grace sighed. She had spent the last few days sorting through her thoughts, but she still didn't have a clear plan. I've been thinking about it. Maybe I should revisit my idea of starting a design business. It was always my dream, but I put it off for… Grace paused, remembering how Diego had belittled her aspirations time and time again. Because of him, Gabriel finished in a stern tone. He's not here to stop you anymore. Do it fair. I know you can. That afternoon, accompanied by Camila, Grace began visiting some places for rent. Although the prices were high, she found a small space in the center of San Miguel de Allende, perfect for a design studio. The walls were peeling, and the floor needed to be renovated, but Grace saw potential in the place. Are you sure you want to start this now? Camila asked as she kicked a piece of debris on the floor. If I wait until I'm completely ready, I'll never do it. This is what I want, Cami, and I'm going to make it work with Gabriel's help and some friends. Grace began remodeling the place during long nights, painting walls and arranging furniture. She found moments of laughter and camaraderie that reminded her of the power of human connections. Little by little, the space began to transform into a reflection of her creativity and passion. One night, while she was checking the final details of the premises, Gabriel handed her an envelope. "This came for you," he said with a worried expression. Grace opened the envelope, and her heart sank as she read the first lines. It was a letter from Rose. Although it did not contain explicit threats, the words were loaded with contempt and venom. "I hope you realize what you've lost. Diego doesn't deserve someone like you, and you'll never be good enough for anyone. Maybe you should think about going back to where you belong and stop embarrassing yourself." The pain was immediate, but something inside Grace had changed. Instead of crying or feeling defeated, she tore the letter into small pieces and threw them in the trash. "I'm not going to let her ruin my life, neither her nor Diego's," she said aloud, more to herself than to Gabriel. Days turned into weeks, and the studio finally opened its doors. Grace decided to name it Renacer, Rebirth, as a symbol of her new life. Although at first there were few clients, word of mouth began to spread, and soon her talent caught the attention of a local designer who offered her a collaboration on an important project. However, just when things seemed to be looking up, the past came back to haunt her. One afternoon, while working on a design, she received a message from Diego. "Grace, we need to talk. I haven't stopped thinking about you." Reading the message was like a bucket of cold water. For a long moment, Grace remained motionless, her thoughts divided between anger and confusion. How could Diego have the audacity to seek her out after everything that had happened? "Who is it?" asked Camila, approaching when she saw Grace's expression. "Fern." She showed Camila the message, and Camila laughed incredulously. "Please, that man has no shame. Let me respond to him." "No, Cami. I'll handle it. My way." After thinking about it for a while, Grace decided not to respond. She blocked Diego's number and continued with her work, determined not to let him interfere in her life again. But the incident left her uneasy. Although she was moving forward, the fear that Diego or Rose try to sabotage her remained latent. That night, as she was closing the studio, she noticed an unknown man watching her from the corner. Although she tried to ignore him, the feeling of danger grew when he began to walk in her direction. She quickened her pace toward her car, feeling her heart pound. When she got home, she told Gabriel what had happened. "Do you think it was someone sent by Diego?" Gabriel asked, clearly concerned. "I don't know. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I can't help thinking that something isn't right." Gabriel nodded and promised to be alert. Grace, for her part, decided not to be intimidated. Although the fear was real, her determination not to give in to Diego's control was stronger. The days following the strange encounter on the corner brought a mixture of progress and tension for Grace. On the one hand, her studio, Renacer, was beginning to gain recognition. Satisfied customers recommended her unique designs, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt she was building something of her own. On the other hand, the constant fear that Diego or Rose would reappear one afternoon while she was working on a special order for an important client. Camila arrived at the studio visibly agitated. "Grace, you have to see this," she said, showing her phone. It was a social media post by Rose, the text loaded with insinuations and disdain. Rose made indirect comments about certain women who don't know their place, and how some relationships end when one person is not up to par. Although she did not mention any names, Grace knew the post was directed at her. "Does she have nothing else to do?" Grace asked in exasperation, putting her pencil down on the table. "She wants to provoke you, Fair. Don't give her the satisfaction, but I think you should take precautions. That woman is not well." Camilla was right. Grace knew it, but she refused to live in fear. That same night, as she was closing up the studio, an envelope slipped under the door caught her attention. When she opened it, she found a photograph of her wedding torn in half, with a handwritten message: "Don't think you can escape your place." The impact was immediate. Grace's hands trembled as she held the photo, and her mind began to fill with questions. Had it been Diego, Rose, or someone else acting on their behalf? Back home, Gabriel and Camilla insisted that Grace report the incident to the police. "This is no longer a simple game of manipulation. It's harassment." "Fur, you can't let it go," said Gabriel, visibly upset. Grace nodded. Although she hated the idea of reliving everything by giving explanations, she knew she had to protect herself. The next day, she went to the police station and filed a report. However, the officer's response was less encouraging than she had hoped. "Miss, without clear evidence that this person poses a direct threat, the most we can do is file the report," said the officer as he typed on his computer. Grace left the station feeling helpless, but also more determined than ever not to let fear control her. A few days later, fate took an unexpected positive turn. During a local design event in San Miguel de Allende, a famous fashion editor took an interest in her work. Impressed by her designs, he proposed a collaboration for an upcoming issue of her magazine. "This could be the boost you need to take your brand to the next level," Camilla said excitedly when Grace shared the news. Although thrilled, Grace knew that this success could attract even more attention from those who wanted to see her fail. Her intuition was not wrong. One night, while working on the design for the magazine, she received a message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she saw a photo of her studio taken from outside, followed by a text, "Be careful what you wish for." Fear took hold of her again, but this time, she wasn't willing to stay silent. She called Gabriel, who arrived at the studio in a matter of minutes. "We're going to install security cameras. If they want to intimidate you, they'll regret it," Gabriel said, as he inspected the entrance. The cameras were installed the next day, and Grace felt calmer. However, the feeling of being watched did not go away. Every time she walked through the streets of the city, she felt eyes on her that vanished when she turned. One day, while reviewing the security footage, she noticed something disturbing. A man in a dark cap was loitering in front of the studio. Although he did not try to enter, his behavior was suspicious. Grace took the recording to the police, hoping that this time they would take action. "This is more concrete. We will investigate, but we suggest you be very careful." "Have you noticed anything else strange in the last few days?" the officer asked. "Yes, I feel like someone is following me, but I'm not sure who it is." Grace's voice trembled as she spoke. That night, while having dinner with Gabriel and Camilla, she tried to find answers. Why would someone want to hurt her like that? How far were they willing to go? "Fair. Maybe you should consider hiring private security, at least until we know who is behind this," Gabriel suggested. Although reluctant, Grace knew her brother was right. Private security was expensive, but her peace of mind was priceless. In the days that followed, a guard began patrolling Gabriel's studio and home. Although the guard's presence gave her a sense of protection, Grace couldn't help but wonder if the danger was closer than she imagined. Let's continue with the fifth part of this intense and dramatic narrative. The decision to hire private security offered Grace a brief respite. Although the guard couldn't be present all the time, his mere presence seemed to deter anyone who might try to approach. However, the fear persisted. The nights at Gabriel's house were long, and insomnia was beginning to take its toll. Grace often woke up startled by noises that turned out to be nothing more than the wind or the footsteps of a neighbor. One night, while reviewing some sketches in his room, Gabriel entered with a serious expression. "I just spoke to the guard. He says he saw someone prowling around the house a few hours ago, but when he went out to check, there was no one there," he said. crossing his arms. Grace's face tensed. The thought of someone being so close was terrifying. "Do you think it could be Diego?" she asked in a whisper. "I don't know, Fair, but whoever it is, we're going to find him." Gabriel leaned over and took her hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "You're not alone." The next day, in the studio, things seemed to be back to normal. Clients were coming in, orders were increasing, and for a moment Grace was able to focus solely on her work. However, that peace was abruptly shattered when an unknown man entered the premises. He was dressed casually, wearing a cap that hid part of his face. He seemed nervous, looking around as if searching for something. "Can I help you?" Grace asked from behind the counter, trying to sound professional despite the knot in her stomach. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly approached the counter, resting both hands on the surface. "Are you Grace?" he asked in a low, almost threatening tone. Grace swallowed hard, but did not show her fear. "Yes. What do you need?" she replied firmly. The man stared for a moment, then took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "A message from someone who wants to help you," he said with a sinister smile before leaving. When he was gone, Grace opened it and found a handwritten letter. "Grace, stop what you're doing before things get worse for you. This is not a warning. It's a promise." Grace's hands trembled as she held the paper. Panic began to take hold of her, but she quickly called Gabriel and Camila. "This is too much. I can't take this situation anymore," she said, showing them the letter when they arrived at the studio. Camila, always the most direct, took the letter and tore it to pieces. "For you can't let them intimidate you. That's exactly what they want." Her voice was firm, but her gaze betrayed her concern. Gabriel, for his part, took more drastic measures. He installed additional locks on the studio door and began to accompany Grace every time she went out. Although these measures helped, the feeling of being watched did not go away. That night, while they were having dinner together, Grace received a message on her phone. It was a photograph taken from outside the house showing her, Gabriel, and Camila sitting at the table. The text accompanying the image read, "Do you really think you're safe?" Fear paralyzed Grace for a moment, but Gabriel reacted immediately. He took the phone and called the police, demanding that they send a patrol to the area. "This is no longer harassment. It's a direct threat," he said angrily as he spoke to the officers. Although the police promised to investigate, Grace knew she couldn't completely rely on them. That night, as she tried to sleep, her mind was filled with questions. Who was behind all this? Rose? Diego? Or someone else with a darker intention? The next day, while Grace was working in the studio, an unexpected client arrived. It was Diego. His presence filled the room with palpable tension. He was wearing an elegant suit, but his expression was somber. She felt a mixture of anger and fear when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, without hiding her annoyance. Diego raised his hands in surrender. "I just want to talk, Grace. Please listen to me. After everything you did, I don't think we have anything to talk about." Grace's voice was firm, but her heart was beating fast. "I know I was wrong, Grace. I've been thinking about us, and I want to fix things." Diego took a step toward her, but Grace backed away. "Fix things? Do you think a few kind words will erase everything that happened?" Her voice broke slightly, but she didn't let the tears fall. Diego tried to continue, but at that moment, Gabriel entered the studio. "What are you doing here, Diego?" he asked harshly, standing between him and Grace. Diego raised his hands again, this time in defeat. "I just wanted to talk, but I see I'm not welcome." He turned to Grace one last time. "This isn't over, Grace." With those words, he left the studio, leaving Grace trembling with rage and fear. Gabriel slammed the door shut and turned to his sister. "This is enough, Fair. We need to make sure he doesn't bother you again." That night, Grace made a decision. Not only was she going to protect herself, but she was also going to confront whoever was behind all this, regardless of the consequences. The encounter with Diego had left Grace in a state of constant alert. Although she was terrified, she was also determined not to be intimidated. That night, while talking to Camila and Gabriel in the kitchen, she began to devise a plan. "I'm not going to let Diego or Rose or whoever is behind this take away what I've built, but I can't go on living in constant fear either." she said, her voice full of determination. Gabriel nodded, his arms crossed and a worried expression on his face. Then we need a strategy. First, let's make sure you're completely protected. We already have the cameras, but we could install more. We should also talk to a lawyer in case this escalates. And let's not forget the police, added Camilla. Even though I don't trust them very much, we should keep them informed of everything. Grace knew her friends were right. The next day, they met with a lawyer to explore their legal options. The lawyer, an older man with a calm demeanor, listened attentively as Grace described everything that had happened. Grace, what you are describing is clear harassment and threats. We can request a restraining order against Diego and his family, but I will need evidence to present the case, he said, adjusting his glasses. Grace handed over the photographs, messages, and security camera recordings, hoping that they would be enough. With this, we can begin, but keep in mind that this process may take time. In the meantime, make sure you stay safe, the lawyer concluded. Although the meeting gave her some peace of mind, Grace knew that there was still a long way to go. Later that night, while checking the security cameras from her phone, she noticed something strange. A dark figure appeared briefly in front of the studio and then disappeared into the shadows. She immediately called Gabriel, who arrived at the scene accompanied by the security guard. They reviewed the recordings more closely and discovered that the intruder had been there for at least 15 minutes, moving around the building as if looking for a way in. This is no coincidence. They're trying to intimidate you, Gabriel said angrily. What if they try something worse? Grace asked, feeling a knot in her stomach. Gabriel didn't respond immediately, but his gaze said it all. They were dealing with someone who wouldn't stop easily. A few days later, while Grace was working on a special order for the magazine, she received an unexpected call. It was Rose. Grace, we need to talk, Rose said in an icy tone. I have nothing to say to you, Rose. Everything you had to say, you already made clear, Grace replied, clutching the phone tightly. Grace clutched the phone tightly. Oh dear, it's not an invitation. It's a warning. You know Diego isn't someone who gives up easily, and neither do I. Do you really think you can go on with your life as if nothing happened? Rose's laughter on the other end of the line was like a knife twisting in her chest. Grace hung up before Rose could say anything else. Her breathing was heavy, but instead of giving in to panic, she picked up the phone and called her lawyer. Rose just threatened me. This has to stop. What else can we do? She asked, trying to remain calm. The lawyer assured her that the call strengthened her case, but that they should proceed with caution. In the meantime, he advised Grace to avoid any direct confrontation that night. Fear turned to anger. Grace wasn't going to let Rose or Diego dictate her life. With the help of Gabriel and Camilla, she decided to organize an opening event at her studio, an act of defiance to show that she would not be intimidated. On the night of the opening, the place was full of friends, clients, and curious onlookers. Grace wore one of her most striking designs, a red dress that radiated confidence and power. Although her heart was beating fast, her smile did not falter. This is incredible, ma fère. Look at everything you've achieved, said Camilla, hugging her tightly. However, the peace of the night was shattered when Grace noticed someone in the crowd. It was Diego. He was standing at the back of the room with a glass of wine in his hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Grace felt the air escape her, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. What are you doing here? She asked, approaching him with firm steps. I just came to congratulate you, Grace. It looks like you've done something interesting here, although I wonder how long it will last, he said in a sarcastic tone. Gabriel appeared next to Grace in a matter of seconds. Diego, get out of here before I have to drag you out, he said, his voice charged with anger. Diego raised his hands with a mocking smile. Calm down. I was just admiring the place. Congratulations, Fair. I hope you enjoy your moment of glory. With those words, he left, leaving behind a cloud of tension. Grace knew that this would not be the last time he would try to interfere in her life, but as she watched her friends and clients enjoying the event, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe she couldn't control everything that happened, but she could decide how to respond. Although the studio opening was a success, Diego's presence cast a shadow over the celebration. Grace couldn't ignore that he seemed determined to interfere, but she wasn't willing to give up. That night, as she was cleaning up the studio with Gabriel's help, the determination in her eyes was evident. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I think you should consider hiring additional security for the magazine event," Gabriel said as he checked the door lock. "You're right, Gabe. I don't want to give them the opportunity to ruin anything else," she replied with a sigh. In the days that followed, Grace focused on the preparations for the magazine project. Her designs were bolder than ever, reflecting not only her creativity, but also her strength and resilience. However, as she worked, the feeling of being watched persisted. One afternoon, while Camila was helping with the final seams, a noise outside the studio caught her attention. Gabriel, who was nearby, went out to check, but found no one, only a wilted flower placed in front of the door. Although it seemed like a harmless gesture, Grace knew it was a message. "This is no coincidence. Someone wants to remind me that they are watching." Grace picked up the flower carefully, trying not to let herself be overcome by fear. Camila crossed her arms, clearly annoyed. "Let them keep watching. We're not going to stop because of their games." Her voice was firm, but her eyes reflected concern. The day of the magazine event finally arrived. Grace, dressed in a suit of her own creation, looked impressive. The venue was elegantly decorated, and the attendees were a mix of clients, designers, and figures from the fashion industry. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, but the perfection was short-lived. As Grace presented her designs on the catwalk, she noticed a familiar figure in the audience. Rose was sitting in the back row with a cold, impenetrable expression. Next to her, a man Grace knew was taking notes in a small notebook. Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she decided to ignore it. She wasn't going to let her presence ruin the moment. However, when the event ended and the guests began to leave, Rose approached her. "Grace, dear, I couldn't miss this. How interesting to see how you're doing. Although I must say I expected something more impressive," she said with a fake smile. Grace looked at her directly, feeling her anger grow. "Rose, you have no business here. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Her voice was firm, but she maintained her composure. Rose laughed softly as if Grace's words did not affect her. "Don't get me wrong. I'm only here to observe, but I'll give you some free advice. Don't get your hopes up. This little success won't last." Before Grace could respond, Gabriel appeared beside her. "It's time for you to leave, Rose. You've said enough." Gabriel's voice was firm and his posture intimidating. It was clear that he would not tolerate any more provocation. Rose left, but not before giving one last look full of contempt. That night, Grace returned home exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Although the event had been a professional triumph, the presence of Rose and her mysterious companion had left a bitter taste. "Fair, you can't keep handling this alone. Let me hire someone to investigate who's behind all this," Gabriel said as he poured a cup of tea for his sister. Grace nodded, finally acknowledging that she needed help. The next day, Gabriel contacted a private investigator, a man named Arturo, who had a reputation for being discreet and efficient. "I'll start by reviewing your camera recordings and tracking any suspicious activity. I'll also investigate Rose and Diego more thoroughly. If they're behind this, we'll know soon," Arturo said during their first meeting. Although Grace still felt a mixture of fear and uncertainty, knowing that someone was working to uncover the truth gave her a small sense of relief. A few days later, Arturo returned with news. He had discovered that the man accompanying Rose at the event was an acquaintance of Diego's, someone with a history of intimidation and blackmail. "This confirms that they are trying to scare you, Grace. But what is most concerning is that this man has been seen loitering near your studio on several occasions," said Arturo. Grace's fear turned to anger. Not only were they trying to ruin her career, but they were also threatening her safety. "They're not going to win. If they want a war, they'll get one." Grace's words were full of determination. That night, while reviewing her sketches at home, she realized something. She had spent too much time letting others dictate her life. Now was the time to take complete control. With the information provided by Arturo, Grace decided to take more decisive action. The fear that had previously paralyzed her now fueled her determination. She knew she couldn't confront Rose and Diego impulsively. She needed to be strategic. That morning, together with Gabriel and Camila, she drew up a plan. First, let's make sure they can't get any closer. If Arturo has enough evidence, we can press charges with a restraining order, said Gabriel, reviewing some legal documents. Second, we need to expose them. If they try to intimidate you, show them that you're not afraid, added Camila, always direct. Grace nodded, although she found it hard to accept that she had to take this situation into the public arena. She knew that remaining silent would only give them more power. A few days later, Arturo presented more information. Rose had been using her influence to discredit Grace in the fashion industry. She had sent emails to potential clients and allies, insinuating that Grace was unreliable and that her designs lacked quality. "This is defamation, Grace. You have the right to sue her," said Arturo, as he dropped a pile of printed emails on the table. Grace felt a mixture of indignation and determination. She was no longer just about protecting herself, but about defending her reputation. "What options do I have?" she asked, looking at the lawyer she had hired. "We can send her a letter demanding immediate cessation. If she does not stop her behavior, we will proceed with the lawsuit. This will not only force her to retract her statements, but it will also expose her tactics," replied the lawyer. Grace approved the plan. The next day, the letter was sent. Although she did not expect Rose to stop easily, she knew that this was the first step to regaining control. Meanwhile, work at the studio continued. Grace immersed herself in her designs, using stress and frustration as creative fuel. One night, while reviewing the final details of a dress for an important client, her phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "Don't think this ends here. We are closer than you imagine." The message was brief, but enough to bring back her anxiety. However, this time Grace did not allow fear to overwhelm her. She immediately reported it to Arturo, who began to trace the origin of the message. A few days later, Arturo appeared with alarming news. The message was sent from a disposable phone, but what is more worrying is that someone has been following your movements. "I have evidence that they have been watching you for weeks," he said, showing photographs taken in different places. Grace felt the air escape her. The idea of being constantly watched was terrifying, but it also enraged her. "Who is behind this? Is it Rose or Diego?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "I can't confirm it yet, but everything points to Rose financing these actions. Diego, on the other hand, seems to be acting more out of desperation than strategy," replied Arturo. Grace knew she couldn't wait any longer. She decided to organize a meeting with her lawyer and Arturo to discuss the next steps. During the meeting, it became clear that the best way to deal with the situation was to expose Rose publicly. Publicly confront Rose. "If we bring this to light, it will be more difficult for them to continue acting in the shadows," said the lawyer. Grace agreed, but she knew that taking this step could have repercussions. As she prepared for what was to come, Grace received a call from a local journalist interested in her story. Although she hesitated at first, she decided to accept the interview. It was her chance to tell her truth and at the same time send a clear message to Rose and Diego. The interview took place in Grace's studio. The journalist, a young and enthusiastic man, allowed her to speak freely about her experience. "Grace, you have faced many challenges in recent months. How do you find the strength to keep going?" he asked during the interview. Grace took a deep breath before answering. "It's difficult, but I think every challenge has made me stronger. It's not just about defending what I've built, but about showing that no one has the right to intimidate or sabotage another person's dreams." Her voice was firm and her message clear. The interview was published a few days later and quickly went viral on social media. Grace received countless messages of support, but she also knew that this exposure could intensify the actions of her enemies. That same night, while reviewing the comments online, she received a message from Arturo. "Grace, I just received some important information. I need to see you tomorrow." Although she was tired, curiosity and fear kept her awake. Something about Arturo could change the course of everything. The next morning, Grace arrived early at Arturo's office. Gabriel accompanied her, insisting that she should not handle this alone. Upon entering, Arturo greeted her with a serious expression, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "Grace, what I discovered changes everything. We have direct evidence that Rose has been financing the intimidation against you. Not only that, but I also found a link between Diego and the man who was seen loitering around your studio." Arturo spread out a dossier full of documents and photographs. Grace looked at the papers carefully. There were bank transfers, intercepted messages, and surveillance reports. Everything pointed to Rose as the mastermind, with Diego carrying out her orders. "This is enough to bring them to justice, right?" asked Gabriel. Looking at the investigator seriously, Grace replied, "Yes, but we must act quickly. If they discover that we have identified them, they could try to destroy the evidence or even intensify their attacks." Arturo took a deep breath. He knew that this was the time to act, but she also understood that confronting Rose and Diego publicly would not be easy. "Let's do it. I can't go on living in fear," Grace's lawyer said firmly. He presented the evidence to the local authorities. Although the process was long and tedious, the case quickly took shape. The police began investigating Rose and Diego, and the first legal actions were set in motion. Meanwhile, Arturo hired an additional security team to protect Grace and her studio. However, Rose did not sit idly by. Just a few days after Grace began the legal process, she received a letter in her mailbox. Inside was a copy of the complaint she had filed, accompanied by a handwritten message: "You're playing a dangerous game. You know you can't win." Grace showed the message to the authorities, who added it as part of the evidence. Although she tried to remain calm, the constant harassment was affecting her mental health. Camila, concerned, encouraged her to take a break. "You need to disconnect for a while. This is all too much. Come spend a few days at my parents' house in the country. No one will find you there." Camila's voice was kind, but insistent. Grace considered the proposal, but she knew she couldn't afford to disappear just when she was so close to the truth. "Thanks, Cami, but I can't leave. Not now. I have to finish what I started." A few days later, Arturo arranged a meeting with Grace and her lawyer. He had obtained new information that not only strengthened the case, but also revealed something more disturbing. "We discovered that Rose is using her network of contacts to delay the investigation. She has friends in positions of power who could try to interfere in the case," Arturo warned. Grace felt anger rising within her. "What can I do to prevent this? I can't let them get away with it again. We need public pressure. If people know what's going on, it will be harder for Rose to manipulate the system." The lawyer looked at Grace seriously. "I know you've already given an interview, but maybe it's time to do something bigger." Grace knew that exposing herself even more could be dangerous, but she also understood that it was necessary. With the help of Arturo and Camila, she organized a press conference. The event took place in her studio, surrounded by friends, clients, and journalists. "Today, I am here to talk not only about what I have faced, but also about what many people face in silence: harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. No one should live in fear. And today, I say enough is enough." Grace's words resonated strongly, and the cameras captured every moment. The conference had an immediate impact. The media began to investigate Rose and Diego, and public pressure intensified. Grace received countless messages of support, but she also knew that this could provoke retaliation. That night, while reviewing the security camera recordings, Arturo called her. "Grace, you have to hear this." His voice sounded tense. Arturo had intercepted a call between Rose and Diego. In the recording, Rose discussed a plan to discredit Grace and, if necessary, use violence to silence her. "I'm not going to let her ruin our reputation. If necessary, we'll make her disappear for a while." Rose's voice was cold and calculating. Fear took hold of Grace once again, but this time it was accompanied by an unbreakable fury. She decided it was time to confront Rose directly. "I'm not going to hide anymore. It's time for them to know that I'm not going to give up," said Grace, looking at Gabriel and Camila with determination. The war was about to reach its most critical point. The final confrontation began to take shape the next day. Grace, accompanied by Gabriel, Camila, and Arturo, presented the intercepted recording of Rose as additional evidence to the authorities. The reaction was immediate. Rose and Diego were called to testify, and the case gained even more notoriety in the media. Meanwhile, Grace was preparing for a crucial meeting. Arturo had managed to arrange a meeting with an influential national journalist who wanted to expose the whole story. Although Grace knew that this would put her even more in the spotlight, she understood that it was the best way to ensure that Rose and Diego could not manipulate the situation to their advantage. The interview took place in Grace's studio, with additional security measures in place. The journalist, a woman with a perceptive gaze and a calm voice, began the conversation with questions about Grace's career before delving into the darker events. "Grace, you have spoken about the harassment you have faced, but how has this affected your personal and professional life?" she asked, bringing the microphone closer. Grace took a breath before responding. "It has been devastating. I have lost sleep, lived in fear, and had to defend myself from constant attacks. But it has also taught me to be stronger, to not remain silent, and to fight for what I deserve." Her voice was firm, but her eyes reflected the vulnerability she still felt. The interview was broadcast that same night, and the reactions were immediate. While many people expressed their support for Grace, Rose's allies began withdrawing from her side, fearful of being dragged into the scandal. Rose and Diego, for their part, remained silent. Although it was clear that they were on the ropes, a few days later Arturo received a call that led him to a crucial discovery. One of Rose's former employees, upset by the abuse he had suffered, decided to testify against her. The testimony revealed a pattern of intimidation and manipulation that not only strengthened the case, but also exposed Rose's true nature to society. With this new evidence, the authorities took action. Rose was formally charged with harassment, defamation, and conspiracy to intimidate Diego. Although less involved, he also faced charges for his participation in the harassment. The day of the trial was tense. Grace, dressed in one of her own designs, sat in the courtroom with Gabri at her side. Rose and Diego, although calm, they could not hide the tension on their faces. When it was time to testify, Grace stood up and faced the jury. "For months, I have been the victim of harassment and intimidation. I have received threats. I have been watched, and my reputation has been relentlessly attacked. But today I am here to tell you that no one has the right to destroy another person's dreams. Rose and Diego used their power to try to silence me, but they did not succeed, and they will not succeed. Will succeed." Grace's words resonated throughout the courtroom, filling it with a force that no one could ignore. The trial lasted for weeks, but finally the verdict was reached. Rose was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to several years in prison, while Diego received a lesser sentence, but one that was sufficient to keep him away from Grace. When she left the courthouse, Grace was greeted by a group of friends, clients, and people who had been inspired by her story. Although the struggle had been long and painful, she had achieved something greater than justice. She had proven that fear should never be stronger than determination. In the months that followed, Grace's life began to stabilize. Her studio became a symbol of resilience, and her designs gained even more recognition. But most importantly, Grace rediscovered her courage and her ability to build a life on her own terms. One night, as she watched the sunset from the balcony of her new home, Camila and Gabriel joined her with a bottle of wine in hand. "Fair, you did it. You've shown that nothing and no one can stop you," said Camila, raising her glass. Grace smiled, filled with gratitude. "I didn't do it alone, but I did learn something. Sometimes the darkest moments lead us to find our true light." With that certainty, Grace closed one chapter of her life and opened another full of promise and possibility. What would you do in this situation? Write your comments. Thank you very much for watching this video. We hope this inspiring story has touched your heart as much as it touched ours when we created it. If you liked it, don't forget to like it, leave your comment, and share it with someone who can also be inspired.